In John 6, we learned that the bread which I give for the life of the world is my flesh. That was already prepared back there in the prologue. That's nothing new to the thematics of this gospel. Again, the flesh of the word is already seen from the very outset as the instrument and substance of redemption. But then, of course, more directly associated with text is the feeding of the 5,000, the manna story, which is directly referred to, even by way of quotation, and as well the Passover allusions. So let's take a look at the feeding of the 5,000, which is a prelude, if I might call it that, to the Eucharistic discourse, or if you will, the bread from heaven discourse. So let's take a look at 6:1 and following. And when Philip earlier today asked about any relationship with synoptics, the feeding of the 5,000, and of course within Matthew and Mark, you also have the feeding of the 4,000, which is very similar. This is one of the few real overlaps that one finds between John and synoptics. The feeding of the 5,000 is, in fact, in all of them. But in John, it is told quite different. Let's take a look. And we will begin at verse 1 of John 6. After these things, Jesus went away across the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. We noted that in chapter 21, this language of the Sea of Tiberias will occur again as kind of a linguistic clue that this scene about to be narrated and John 21 are related scenes. Now, a great crowd was following him, for they saw the signs which he was doing upon the weak or the sick. And Jesus went up into the mountain, and there sat down with his disciples. And now you have verse 4. Now the Pascha was near, the festival of the Jews. Only in John are we told that the feeding of the 5,000 was within the chronological nearness of the Passover. Now, here commentators have a choice to make. Either you can think that this is a mere chronological marker, or you can think that it's certainly that. It's certainly a chronological. But you can also think, as I would suggest, we do think that it's also a thematic marker. After all, apart from the Festival of Tabernacles, there's no doubt that the Passover festival is a guiding feast throughout the Gospel of John. It is mentioned no less than 3 times. Whenever Jesus is in Jerusalem, except for John 7, it's during the Passover. It begins already in John 2, right before he does the cleansing of the temple. It's now in the feeding of the 5,000, and again when he enters into Jerusalem. So the Passover is not simply a chronological marker feast. It is a thematic feast. And so we can't, and of course, Jesus has already been introduced as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Part of the background of that is the Paschal Lamb. No doubt about that either. So the idea that here the mention of the Passover is merely a chronological marker just strikes me as a certain Philistian and move. Kind of a refusal not to see something. But you find it all over the place. Well, that's that. Lifting up his eyes, Jesus, and seeing that the large crowd was coming to him, he says to Philip, now note the Greek. From where? Pothen. And I have noted, and this gives me a good chance to repeat this. Pay attention to this pothen. From where? Here we see that suffix again. Then, from where? Which we saw in John 10:1, for example. From where? Or should we purchase bread that we might feed, these might eat? Already this pothen lets you know that you're not simply dealing, not thematic. You are not simply dealing with filling bellies. Because pothen is a marker of Jesus' mission from the Father. We do not know from where this man comes. So pothen is a Christological marker in the Gospel of John. That's why you want to pay attention to when it occurs. From where are we going to purchase bread that these might eat? Now this he said, testing Philip. For Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. How did he know what he was going to do? Well, very many commentators, even more liberal, think that this is simply a statement of the omniscience of Jesus, something like that. Well, I don't want to deny that he's omniscient, but keep in mind that Jesus is intentionally and with open eyes fulfilling and consummating scriptural narratives. Already in John 5, he was told the Jews, you search the scriptures because you believe in them who have eternal life. But these witness concerning me. So Jesus already is referring to the manna story by implication. He knows what he's going to do because it was an expected sign of the second Moses, an eschatological thing, that he would do the signs again that Moses did in the wilderness, or that happened. So Moses was a bread giver, if you want. So when Jesus knew what he was going to do, it was because he had read the Bible. He knew the Bible. He knew the manuscript. He knew its importance for the exodus of the new Israel. And so Philip replied to him, well, 200 denarii would not even suffice purchase bread, that each could even receive but a little bit. He said one from his disciples, namely Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, says to Jesus, there's a kid here. Pidarion is, of course, a diminutive of Pais, which is itself a little child. So this little kid is here who has 7 barley loaves of bread and 2 apsari, 2 fish. Now, as I noted yesterday when we just briefly, but what is this such as many as these? Finish the verse. As I noted yesterday when we were looking at John 21, the early iconographic symbol of the Eucharist was 5 bread and 2 fish, or simply the fish. as a Eucharistic Christ. The fish was not just a figure for Christ, but a figure of the Eucharistic Christ. And so this is no doubt, unless we simply wish to discount altogether what we know from later and quite early later iconographic depictions, as well as early Christian commentary. This is already a Eucharistic with 5 barley loaves, because we also know that early Christians, where we have evidence for this, by the way, and it's not every place that we do, but when we do, it tends to be barley loaves, which was the Eucharistic bread. Barley loaves was the cheap bread of the peasant. It was not refined like wheat. So 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, opsaria, again, were rather fine fish, usually prepared well for banquets. It's not then going to be a perch that you drag out of the Tennessee River. So there's already Eucharistic overtones. By the way, one of the very earliest, perhaps the earliest, depiction of a Eucharistic scene we have in early Christian iconography is usually dated around the year 120. It's in Rome, in the catacombs of Caecilian and Scylla even. It's in what is called the Capella Graeca, the Greek chapel, which appears to have been a gathering place for the Christians in Rome from very early on. And it is decorated by scenes drawn exclusively, so it seems, because it's not, some of it is effaced over time. But as far as we can tell, all scenes, this is Fifi along the scenes. No, it's this ugly woman whose name is, you get this name, Potential Span. What an ugly pig she is, really. So
I think we all know her.
I think she's a loose woman. Thank you for that. All scenes in the Graeca Capella, as far as we can tell, are drawn from John's Gospel. Now that's a very interesting data for various reasons. It means that by the early 2nd century, John had not only made his way to Rome, which in itself may not be too surprising, but had become the primary text for early Christian depiction. That's kind of interesting. Who is that? Who is that? Was that you?
Not me.
Was that? That was you. I was going to say, my dinger isn't that loud. Okay. So we go on here, and Jesus said, make the men on a passing to recline. This is the word for reclining at a banquet table. And as you may know, at the Passover festival, you had to recline. At the Passover table where you ate the Passover festival, the feast of the Passover, you did not sit at table as we now are here. The Jews did sit at table as we are now, but not at the Passover. There it was prescribed posture to recline, because reclining was the posture of freedom. You cannot get up quickly from the posture of reclining at table. And so it was understood to be Passover posture of freedom from bondage. But anyway, and if you go to the Markan scene, there we have the interesting, and it's repeated twice, that they recline on grassy land and hold a symposium. What an interesting word, right? The symposia in which you had common meals of friends, at which time you would make common hymns or songs or philosophical discourses or whatever the group was characterized. But Eric.
So that's a conscious change they made from the original Passover when they stipulated that they were to be standing in order to communicate we're not in slavery anymore.
The documentation for this comes in Jeremias. Joachim Jeremias is the Eucharistic words of Jesus. So I don't have that off the top of my head, Eric. I'm sorry, but that's where you can find this. Now we are also told that there was much grass in that place. We are told later on that this was on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Have you ever been there? Is there a lot of grass?
Yeah.
No, a lot of rocks. This is also unique, not unique to John. But it is an interesting, especially when later on you talk about pasture. Grass usually is a place of green, water, and all that time. So there's a certain maybe paradisial implication here. Keep in mind, I'm drawing significances out of what are presented as kind of simple facts in it. But simple facts oftentimes don't need to be reported. And especially if they're kind of unique, as some of these are to John, we should at least take note of them. Anyway, there were 5,000 men.
No connection to Psalm 23.
Well, there could be. I would think that the extent of what I call connotative meanings that are associated with it, if not with the primary, would lead towards pasture issues and things like that. But again, I don't deny that I'm interpreting the text. And he took, now we have language which is directly parallel with what we call the words of institution. He took bread, Jesus, and having blessed it, prayed over it, oikolisthesos, Jesus is depicted here, unlike the synoptics, because the synoptics say that Jesus gave to the disciples and they distributed. But here, Jesus is actually the one who is doing all the actions. He distributes it to those who are reclining. And similarly, also from the fish as much as they want. Keep in mind in verse 21, chapter 21, we have bread and the opsarion again. And when they had taken their fill, take a look at Exodus 16:12 in view of that word. I think I got that right. Exodus 16:12. Well, okay. And this, of course, is within the manna story as Exodus gives it. And at twilight you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall be filled with the bread. So we have here, and then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And so the eating of the manna was a manifestation of the knowledge of God. So, and when they had completed or filled up, a reference then, oftentimes John doesn't so much quote the Old Testament directly, but alludes to it. He says to his disciples, "Synagogue." Synagogue was the technical language of ingathering, which one finds in texts such as Ezekiel 36 and other texts as well that speak, Isaiah, for example, Jeremiah, for example, that speak of the ingathering because they are led together. And it's not surprising then, and perhaps it's to be at least noted, that perhaps earliest language about the Eucharistic assembly it was called the synaxis. That people which is gathered together, those that have been brought together to one place, epitop upon the self-same spot. Typical language, certainly within Eucharistic context, for example, by Ignatius of Antioch. So here you have Festival of Tabernacles language, at least thematics, showing itself again within the feeding of the 5,000. Gather together the klausmata, the pieces of bread that have been torn off. Jesus broke the bread, klao, in the synoptic accounts. Now we're speaking of the particles of bread broken off that have been left over. And so you have the language again of the Last Supper, such as the synoptics reported. You have oikolistia, you have klausma, you have diadonai, you have also lambanote. This kind of usage of language is not accidental. I really do believe that one is forcing issues if you think it's simply accidental. This is not the language you use if you're just handing out cookies. In order that none be lost. Apollomy has already been introduced, for example, in John 3:16. The Father loved the world in this manner, that he gave over his only Son into death, that whoever believes in him should not be apollomy, destroyed. So clearly this gathering is over against being destroyed. It's not a neutral, let's clean up the county park. It strikes me as almost fleeing Eucharistic interpretation. When one exegete from the ELCA, which is a Lutheran Seminary, St. Paul, his name is Tester, a good scholar, but he maintains and he adduces some rabbinic statements to this effect, that it was Jewish praxis after a meal to clean up the table. Well, I just cannot believe that's the background for gather up the klausmata, lest all anybody or anything be destroyed. Because clearly that is which is going to be destroyed is the klausmata. So the klausmata to be destroyed means what? To grow rancid or something like that as it lies on the ground? No, the klausmata are the people who are in dispersion. Unless they are gathered in, they will be left in destruction. And so they gathered them in, we are told, and they filled 12 baskets full. Well, that can hardly be without its significance. So what we have is an ingathering of dispersed, broken off cosmata, which fill 12 baskets full. In other words, this ingathering will be the reconstitution, or is this figurative symbol, if you want, of the reconstitution of the eschatological. And this is the primary view that John represents. Basically stays within the conceptuality of the ingathering of dispersed Israel. However, as we've seen in any number of issues or scenes, the fishing at Lake Tiberias in John 21, where I have sheep that are not of this fold of John 10:16, he is aware of and looks forward to the missiological outreach also to the Gentiles. But they are to be brought into new Israel. What you don't have is a new humanity notion, such as you might in Paul. What you have is the eschatological Israel, which will include the Jew as well as believing Gentile. So we have here then, they want to make Jesus king and so forth. So he goes away. Then they say, oh, the heck with this. Well, I'm going to go to Capernaum. There's a McDonald's over there. Jesus gets in the boat, goes over to, then has the bread of life discourse. But what you have in the feeding of the 5,000 is at least a feeding scene which is replete with Eucharistic language and commands, which are themselves embedded in what I have termed Festival of Tabernacles in gatherings. Now, one cannot go to the Bread of Life discourse as though this is not there. And if one accepts my interpretations, that this is replete and pervasive of Eucharistic ideas, language, and thematics, then that carries over, at least methodologically, as a likely situation as we move further into the text. That's one thing. So as background, we have one more extensive, one only by way of mention. We have two backgrounds, both of which regard actual eating. The Feast of the 5,000 and the mention of Passover obviously entails the eating of the Passover. So if one accepts the mention of the Passover as a thematic and not merely a chronological mark, then at least implicitly shimmering in the background is the coming feast in which you will eat the Passover. When Jesus then later on does say, unless you eat my flesh, you have no life in you, that does play into eating of the Passover lamb, which is reported on the night of the 10th plague, when the angel of death passed. And of course, the manna story, that unless you should eat of it, you die. And they did die. So, and the manna story is explicit. It is introduced by the Jewish interlocutors and actually is quoted then in chapter 6, verse 31. The actual quotation there is actually closer to Psalm 78 that you find in the margin than in Exodus 16. So the actual language may be more from the Psalm than Exodus. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But now then we have three backgrounds before we enter the bread of life. The mention of Passover, which at least implies that there will be a feeding of the Passover. The feeding of the 5,000. And the manna story. So you have three backgrounds if we accept the Passover. We have three backgrounds to the bread of life discourse, all of which have to do with an actual eating. Now, my argument against some who then say that the eating in John 6 as we enter further in is in fact a symbol for faith is that I want to know whether elsewhere in John's gospel, John moves from the concrete to the figure. John's method is not to move from the concrete particular of the Old Testament to the New Testament figurative or spiritual. It is rather to move from the concrete particular Old Testament to the concrete particular New Testament, which has to do with the incarnated Word and what he gives as his flesh. So I think the move, given especially these three backgrounds, that now we are speaking of eating as faith, is a methodological misstep. And I at least want to know where else in the gospel does that happen. And I don't think it happens anywhere. So I'm not sure it happens.
Is that in line with Luther?
No. And I'm always kind of befuddled by this. And I don't know. Now, there are, of course, Lutherans that use John 6 all over the place for the Lord's Supper. They saw the Lord's Supper, at least in the second part. Their Ehlert did is another one, just to mention another. If you take a look at the Meditationes of John Gerhardt concerning the Lord's Supper, it all is based upon John 6. He doesn't refer to the words of institution at all in that meditation. And of course, if you take a look at our hymn book, a lot of those bread or months ago, blessed bread from heaven or something like that, right?
Eat we manna from God.
Yeah, okay, so we, and of course, people like Chemnitz and Luther said that it's really faith, but what we see here attributed to faith is also attributed to the Lord's Supper. Well, I just don't think John is working like that. And in my rant, I guess that's what it was earlier today, I kind of indicated why I don't. It's not that stuff of faith. Oh, by the way, it's also the stuff of supper. Right? John's not working that way. Pace Luther, I'm sorry, God bless him. But John is not working that way. And if you think he is, you got to demonstrate.
So what was the hard sayings that disciples had trouble with and it drove
Well,
what offended everybody?
No doubt this. I mean, eating flesh and eating blood was seen as being cultically unclean. And so Jesus says, and you're totally right in pointing this out. Chapter 6, where is it? In 60 verses there. And many from his disciples went away, eschon apiso, to the back, went back, and no longer walked around with him. We say we're his disciples. And so Jesus addresses now the 12. It's the only time, except in the farewell discourse, that the 12 were actually so designated. Do you as well wish to go away? Or to go? And Simon Peter said to him, Master, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And here you have these perfect forms, and we have believed in you, and we have recognized that you are the Holy One of God. Now, the Holy One of God is largely a temple designation of one who can serve in the temple. And then Jesus says to them, I did not choose you, the 12. Or perhaps it's a question. Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet from you there is one who is the devil, one devil. He's Theological. And he was speaking of Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot. Now this is very interesting, especially if we want to ask the question, is this a Eucharistic discourse? Here is a fact. In every instance where the Lord's Supper is talked about, Judas as the betrayer is part of that narrative. Without exception. Now, of course, you can abstract the words of institution and talk about them dogmatically. You can, of course, do that. I'm talking about early Christian biblical narration. And it became so commonplace that even today in our own agenda, when you stand at the altar, how do you start the words of institution? On the night in which he was betrayed. In other words, and if you take a look at, say, Matthew's upper room discourse is only one. I don't know. I used to know the number of verses. I set my mind, let's say 25. It's something. Of which about 20 have to do with Judas. In other words, if you give the upper room stuff of Matthew, there is 4 times more space given to Judas and his betrayal than to the words of this. And in John 13, we see the same thing. Judas is immediately mentioned. That the Satan already having thrown into his heart that Judas was going to betray him. That's already in verse 2. And of course, later on, there's almost 10 verses where Peter says to the beloved disciples, who the heck is he talking about? Somebody's going to betray him. And then you're told that Jesus actually gives Judas the morsel of bread and then says, do what you're going to do quickly. And Judas leaves the supper, and it was night. In other words, there's almost within John 13, 20 verses that have to do with Judas. Conclusion. The betrayal of Judas was an essential part of the upper room institution. And so when we find there's not the slightest cause in this text, John 6 at this point, to bring in Judas. Tell me thematically why Judas has to here be introduced. He doesn't. That he is here introduced is a frankly very clear sign that you're dealing with Judas. If that is not the case, this is unique in this particular set of circumstances that I just described. Even when Paul went to course, which is from where we get our agenda, Paul has it too, on the night in which he was handed over Christ. It is always there, without exception.
So they were baptism, Lord's Supper are necessities. And then so in 653 it says on must needs. Same thing we had on must.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's usually in 6, that's used as an argument as faith, eating faith, because there's an absolute.
Yeah.
But that never gets set about down 3, at least in our schools.
Well, that's correct.
But is there anywhere,
Yes.
I mean, anywhere else in the Gospels that speaks of it as not being a necessity?
Well, no, and it is an inconsistency. And of course, and you pointed this out to me earlier today, the necessity of the Lord's Supper to have life in you. But if you take John at his own argument, his own way of thinking, what he's actually talking about, it is strictly speaking true, because Jesus, as the incarnated Son, and I would add crucified, is life. He's not an instrumental that bestows life. He is himself life. So how, in fact, does he bestow it except to give himself? And so if that's the case, to eat his body and blood is, strictly speaking, to have life in you. Is this a materialistic, physical way of thinking? You bet it is. But this is exactly what I was saying earlier in my judgment, and you test this out for yourself in your own study. Does John move from a concrete particular of the Old Testament, say the manna story, the eating of the flesh of the Passover, to a purely spiritual notion of such eating? Or does he move from an Old Testament meat eating to a New Testament eating, the one prefigurement, the other reality? I think it's the second way. It's a methodological. But also, and perhaps even more, Greg, to your point and to your question, and this has kind of been the subtext. I apologize for not being adequately transparent. But it's been a subtext when I say that the place of salvation. So let me ask you this question, purely rhetorical. Is salvation necessary to have salvation? Well, yes. So to be in the place where there is salvation is necessary for you to be safe. So this idea of the Jewish eschatology that to be saved, to be in the place of salvation, is the place of the temple and its sacrifice. Where is that in the New Testament reality? If, in fact, as I have tried to argue, that the crucified Jesus, in the concretion of and particularity of his battered body, is nothing other than the substance of eternal life, then that is the place of salvation. Is it necessary? The thematics of Old Testament Jewish eschatology make the Lord's Supper or the New Testament temple necessary. So again, extra ecclesiam non solus est. Question: is it necessary to be in the church to be saved? According to that statement, yes.
Choose an exile can still be saved also.
You know, there's an interesting book by, again, Joachim Jeremias, called Die Verheißung des Volkes, I believe. Promise of the nation to the people. And it is a very nice articulation of what I have here called Jewish eschatology. This book has now been translated into English. You might want to take a look at it, either the German or the English, whichever. Where, again, Jeremias makes the claim with his own evidences, and I kind of reflected this, that in fact, for the Jew, one could not be saved outside of this. Again, in such texts as Ezekiel 36. Now, I'll come back. to be outside the land of promise was be in the place of penultimus, the place of judgment and condemnation. And so you had to be where God is. Now it could be, and probably was, that as certain Jews, maybe Philo, I have to double check this, that spiritualized this New Jerusalem. There were, after all, Platonizing Jews that took offense at the fact that you actually talked about a geographic place. You see that against the Christians with somebody like the philosopher Celsus. What? You think God is only interested in that little plot of land? Well, you can see the point. Well, that little plot of land was for the Jew, that little plot of land that made all the difference. So it's not quite true, I don't think, that they could be saved just anywhere. And the Exodus thematics would be the primary argument for that.
Seems like the Babylonian Talmud might say they could.
Well, in the Babylonian, well, indeed, the problem with the Babylonian Talmud, of course, is that it's, who knows, really, but maybe 70% of it dates from no earlier than 300. It's difficult to have any idea of what really goes back to the first century here. And of course, the Babylonian Talmud arises with the temple now destroyed, right? And so obviously the rabbis have to take an account of this. How are we going to console our people when they can't actually go there? So it may well be, you may be right, that it was an accommodation to a post-temple period of time. But that would not have been the case in God's. There you do have the temple. And of course, as I noted, the centrality of the festival of tabernacles. When the temple is destroyed, there will never again, to this day, be a celebration of tabernacles. There could be.
When you say go to Jerusalem, you mean
When I
if the
say,
pilgrimage was made by, say, representative of the that's the requirement. So, I mean, obviously, not all of Israel could descend on Jerusalem to be saved, but have people who make the annual pilgrimage as representative for others.
right, the Exodus, certainly when it comes to the eschatological Exodus, was a final ingathering. And at this point, the temple did seem to assume more, shall we say, heavenly aspects. So we have already in at least pre-Jesus Judaism, expectations that the geographic temple in Mount Zion is an image of a heavenly temple. And that in the final eschatological fulfillment, the temple will in fact encompass all things. We see that again in the Christology. Heaven and earth is filled with your glory. The glory of God is a temple. So the glory of the new temple, of the new Jerusalem, the new temple, would in fact be universal in extent. That's true. And the only place, it's hard always to know how he would envision this. But you, of course, did have Chiliasts in the early church who actually thought in terms of geographic Israel, just as you do today if you turn on your television set. And when I had this revision surgery on my knee in late February, about 4 weeks, I couldn't really do anything. So what am I going to do? I'm going to watch television, smoke cigars, and drink whiskey. And so, what television am I going to watch? Well, why not Jimmy Swaggart? So I watch a lot of Jimmy Swaggart. Very interesting. I mean, first of all, how interesting they center on Christ crucified. Very interesting. Now, they don't quite see anything like we do here, but nonetheless, the focus on Christ crucified was striking. But then, of course, their eschatology is really something else. The rapture of all of this. And I remember this one time in which Jimmy Swaggart, who's quite an interesting figure in terms of his musical capacity and all the rest, speaking capacity, he's not an insignificant figure. I think he's totally out there. But that doesn't make him stupid. But in this one instance, I think he was stupid. Because he said, the New Jerusalem, and I don't know exactly where, he must have got these from the Bible someplace, will be 1,500 miles wide and 1,500 miles long, 1,500 miles high. In other words, a cube of 1,500 miles.
That's the dimension.
Oh, okay, that's all right. Well, there you have it, right? And then, of course, the streets are really of gold and all the rest. Well, that's what happens when finally you refuse any kind of spiritualizing of the geographic notion, except you stretch it out. But keep in mind, if I'm right about John's gospel, the New Jerusalem is a person. So the question is not kind of, in what sense does the person of the incarnate divine Son, especially in what we call his state of glorification, in what sense is he in a place? It's not an easy thing to talk about. And so the dogmatician says he's in a place according to humanity and illocal in another thing. In other words, you have no clue what's going on. And so you basically say things that have to be said in order not to say something false. What I call the doxological function of dogma. It's basically a hedge that you're not a heretic.
Would Oral Roberts 1,500 foot Jesus fit in that box? Okay.
15, well, he'd have room to roam in Jimmy Swaggart's New Jerusalem. That's
Build up Eric and Greg here. Lenski's commentary on Acts 2, when it says there are Jews dwelling in Jerusalem from every nation, he says that along with the visitors, there were Jews that essentially retired there, like you guess you retired Florida. So my question is, was there ever a movement where they had like hospitals or where people would say, "I'm going to die in Jerusalem," or "We're getting close to dying," and you would actually pick up your tent poles and move?
well, I don't know about the hospitals, although we do know of certain early Christian facilities in and around Jerusalem that would fit that description. Nonetheless, the Garden of Gethsemane, or the Mount of Olives generally, was traditionally understood to be the site of the resurrection of the dead. Jesus would come down there, and that's where the resurrection of the dead would commence. Not surprisingly, it became a favorite burial. So it's a big cemetery. Some years ago, when the Hilton wanted to make a huge big hotel there, the Hilton Mount of Olives, and they succeeded. Where was a Palestinian terrorist when you really needed one? Well, of course, there was a huge brew hall, the traditional Jew, because it was basically, corrupting the site of where the resurrection was going to start. In other words, if you're in room 203 of the Hilton, if somebody starts knocking on your door and the building starts shaking, put a towel around your body if you're in a shower, because things are going to happen.
6:14, the Ascension. Does that fit in with your 12:37 from yesterday? And
6:14 says what?
when people saw the sign which he had
Oh.
done.
Yes. Yeah, the sign which he had done. Again, the language of signs in John's Gospel is largely taken from Deuteronomy. The monastery was one of the major 3 signs. I mentioned that earlier today, for the sojourn in the wilderness. So yes, no doubt they thought that he was the new Moses, hence the word prophet. Behold, the prophet has come into the world. That is a reflection of Deuteronomy 18:15-18, where God says to Moses that he will raise up amongst your brethren another one like you. So there was expected a new Moses figure. And to some extent, this new Moses figure does inform New Testament Christology, such as in this place. It wasn't sufficient, however, to finally take care of the full dogmatic thrust of New Testament Christology. And so if we take a look at the history of Christology as Jesus as the new Moses, by the end of the 2nd century, it is largely gone. And notion of the divine Son and other things like that are beginning to be much more common. So it was kind of a Jewish, if you will, a Jewish eschatological expectation. And I suppose after time, especially maybe the Gentile Christians just didn't know what meaning it had. Or just didn't cease to be a significant aspect. Well, thank you for all this conversation and discussion. Any other questions that you may have or comments? Leave it up to you, Greg. We have about 50 minutes by way of your watch, right?
There we can go along.
Okay, that's fine with you.
Quarter at.
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely fine. Okay, again, any question? Are you going to really leave it to, oh, well, anything more on John 6 that you want specific? Let's take a look then took a look at John 12. Let's take a look at John 9, which is the healing of the blind man, often thought to be a pivotal text, and certainly it is. But here again, you have to read John's Gospel with your mind open. That is to say that there's more going on than is said at the superficial, or if you want, literal level. That is certainly also going on. But more is going on. And you should be prepared to see theological meaning in what otherwise seems to be nothing more than a historical or geographical notice. For example, verse 9:1. In passing by, Jesus keeps in mind, note, by the way, John 8:59, just above. Of course, Jesus has just said, before Abraham was, I am. And so they took up stones that they should cast them at him. But Jesus ekrube. This is a largely middle form, or used as a middle form of krufto, to hide oneself. Now, what it does not mean is that Jesus ran and hid behind a pile of rocks, or went to a place that was dark within the temple precincts so they couldn't see him. It's not that he's hiding as in hide and seek. It is rather that he is making himself unknowable to the Jews. And that he does by insisting upon and presenting himself as the crucified, exalted Lord. So again, his manifestation is at the same time possessing of the potential of not knowing. Those who saw Jesus could either see him or not see him. They both saw the same thing. Seeing is never purely or hearing, is never purely life in this gospel. To see is to see with your eyes. To hear is to hear with your ears. Yet, do you see what your eyes see? What your eyes saw was a man. And so the Jews see a man. And so they say to themselves, why in the Sam heck is this man making claims of God about himself? He's a blasphemer. Of course we should stone him. Others see the man and say, behold the Son of God. So you're seeing the same thing, but you're not seeing. And so likewise, Jesus here is making himself unknowable in the same way that he makes himself knowable. So he leaves then the temple, exits the temple, end of verse 59. Chi. You see that chi? That is a connecting chi that tells you that there is no real new thing. It's connecting to the previous statement or the previous context, which began in John 8:12. I am the light of the world. A statement that recurs in verse 5. Whenever I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So there's no doubt that the bringing to sight of this blind man is a function, an illustration, an elaboration, a manifestation of Jesus' reality as the light. But what does it say about this? First of all, we were told that he was blind ex genetes, from birth. Now, what does that mean? Of course it means, at one level, I'm not sure I like the language of level, but I can't think of any better way to express it. So at one level, of course it means that he was born blind. His mother gave him birth and he was blind. Terrible thing, a blind newborn. That's what it means. But it also means something else thematic, which we have already been introduced to in John 3. Not exactly by way of the same thematic images, but by way of the same truth. When Jesus wanted to say, unless you be begotten from above, you cannot see the kingdom of heaven, Nicodemus says, what? Shall an old man call back into his mother's womb and be born a second time? In other words, to be born of a Jewish mother is now a deeply penultimate reality. And if that which is born of a Jewish mother, that is to say, the traditional Jew, understands the things of his Old Testament, the synagogue, the Torah, the sacrificial cultus in the temple, and all the rest, and he understands them according to their own referent that we've talked about previously. In the terms of John's Gospel, they are blind. They do not see Jesus for what he is. So at the same time, he is depicted here as a Jew who does not see, not just physically, but does not see because he was born blind from birth. He's a Jew. But the disciples inquire of Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this guy or his parents that he should be born? Here you have genethe yet again. Here it has to be translated born, that he would be born blind. And indeed, there were rabbinic speculations about birth defects and things like that, and who was the cause of it. And sometimes the parents sin in rabbinic debate, and even in some early Christian discussions. Somebody might quote that God punishes the sons of the fathers to the third, fourth generation, and that kind of thing. But Jesus debunks it. He says, he did not sin, nor did his parents. But in order that the works of God might be made manifested in this man. Works of God, of course, is a creation terminology. And now you have verse 4, most likely, although there's a variant in the manuscript tradition, most likely the plural amos is to be accepted, not the singular in that. So who is this we? It is necessary that we work the works of him who sent me while it is day, for night is coming when no one is able to. Who is this we? Well, the Father and Jesus have been suggested, but my own hunch is that it's Jesus and the man born blind will come to see. Because as we move through this text, John 9, what will happen is that Jesus appears, obviously. He will tell the man to go wash himself in the pool of Siloam. That's in verse 7 or so. And Jesus disappears altogether from the text until verse 35. And so the man born blind who comes to see becomes, if you will, a stand-in for Jesus. He's the Christological figure of the chapter. And so as we might expect, and as in fact we find, what we have learned about Jesus elsewhere in the text becomes true of this man himself. When I am in the world, I am the light of the world, verse 5. And having said these things, Jesus spit upon the ground and made clay from the spittle. And strictly speaking, at least at this point, anointed his eyes with the spittle. Epikleo. Now it's an interesting word, obviously, epikleo. It means to anoint, kind of a Christos word, right? But maybe we shouldn't make too much of it, because later on, epitithemi is used, which means to place upon. Doesn't have nearly the rich connotations that epikleo does. So maybe we should make too much of it. But nonetheless, he placed this mud upon the eyes of the blind man. Now, what background text comes to your mind here?
Genesis.
Pardon?
Genesis.
I'm sorry, Genesis. The creation of man, where God makes clay from the dust of the earth. It was a commonplace, certainly with the early Christian articulation, that when God breathed on the dust, his breath was moist and gave the dust of the earth, which was dry in itself, a certain pliability where he could form man, as Irenaeus says, with his two hands. As you know, if you go to the beach or to a dry riverbed on shore, and you try to make a sandcastle of dry sand, it's pretty hard to do. But if you make it moist, you can mold it. So the fact that God's breath was moist was already seen as a baptismal image in creation. His breath, spirit, the moistness of his breath, water. Now, whether you buy all that or not, that's your business. I'm simply saying it was a commonplace in early Christian interpretation. In any case, it corresponds to this. God made spittle and formed the clay and put it on his eyes. And then he says to the man, "Hupago." And here, Philip, I will point out to you again the use of this verb, hupage. I mentioned this yesterday to you. Very often, maybe not every time, but very often it has the connotation of Jesus going to his death. When now he says to this man, "Go," he could have just said, "Poirot." That he uses hupago kind of begins, in terms of the usage of this verb in this text, begins to have the connotative sense of Jesus' mission as the crucified. In any case, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which being interpreted means apostol, this present perfect form of apostello, namely the one who has been sent, or merely the sent one. Now, actually, again, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, Siloam does not mean that. Nonetheless, this is what John says, because he wants to make a Christological point. And so Jesus says to the man, in effect, "Go wash yourself in the one who has been sent." Now, if the man washes himself in the one who has been sent, what has the man who now sees become? A sent one. Exactly. And that's what we see in the rest of the text. And we are then told, and I'm going to have Greg now read again from the ESV. It says, "He went away therefore and washed himself, and," now the very last of verse 7, please.
So he went and washed and came back seeing.
"And came back seeing." But this is not exactly what the Greek says. It does not say came back. Very often commentators think that what this means, for example, D.H. Westcott's a great example, but hardly the only one, that it means that the man went away, washed himself, and went back home. Because the next verse speaks of his neighbors. So he went back home, now as a seeing man. But I want to point out to you that the word erchomon, especially in its aorist form as here, eothen, is often used of Jesus as having come into the world. We saw that already in chapter 9, verse 39, when we started talking about the Good Shepherd Discourse. I have come for klima. As klima have I come into the world. Eothen. And so we should translate quite specifically. He washed himself and came, in brackets, now in the midpoint of, as participant in Jesus' mission, seen. And we see that because he is now colored by Christological colorations. Let's see how. Therefore, his gentleness, his neighbors, and those who saw him previously that he was a beggar, said, is not this the guy we saw sitting, begging? And others said, well, maybe it seems to be, and others said, no, not. Now, this simply corresponds to the common Christological point that the Jews did not recognize Jesus. They did not know him. So is this the guy who we saw begging? Some said yes, some said no, some said I have gone to find him. What does he say? What does he say?
I am man.
Well, that's what your English translation says. But it says, in fact, ego in me. And so when you, and this is why this English translation is quite mischievous, because in such a response, yes, I am he, or I am the man, he's basically saying, yeah, I'm the guy who you used to see blind and begging. But that's not what he's saying. He's basically saying, my identity is now altogether new. I might have been that guy, but now I am ego me, which is, of course, a Christological title. And what is further on to be noted is that behind this text is the vision of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, where he sees the Lord high and lifted up. In fact, Isaiah 6:10 will be quoted in John 12. But in the Septuagint form of this vision, we are told, of course, that Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up. The language is the language of example again. Example language there in the vision. And then God, of course, wants somebody to send to the hard-hearted people. And so God says, who will I send? And in the Septuagint, in the Hebrew, and hence in the English translation that you're familiar with, he says, Isaiah answers, here am I, send me. So, but in the Septuagint, Isaiah answers, ego me. So this is a direct echo of the Septuagintal rendering of Isaiah 6. Where the ego eimi is the one who is sent to preach to Israel, which is exactly now what this man does. So he calls himself, first of all, then the ego eimi. And they said to him, and notice how often through John 9, the language post is used. And so they said to that one, and so they said to him, how were your eyes opened? This post question occurs again in verse 15. It occurs again in 16. it occurs again in 1921, also again in 26. In all of those verses, the question is asked, how did you come to see, or how was your sight given to you? When you see that kind of repetition, you realize that that question is moving the narrative. And in this case, because it is being asked, how did it happen? It has the function of causing the miracle event. He placed clay upon my eyes and told me to wash, and I see. It causes that to be repeated over and over again. In other words, the how of the coming to sight is crucial to the story. That I have been washed in the one who has sent. And so then he answers, he made clay and he put it upon my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And I went away and I washed myself and I have come to see him. And having said this, they asked, where is that one? Here you have that proof. Where are you remaining? And here he said, I don't know. And so they lead him to the Pharisees. This is more or less a judicial event now. He's being brought to interrogation to the Pharisees. This is not then intended to be a friendly discussion, because we are told this happened on the Sabbath. And there are various reasons why this broke Sabbath regulations, such as you cannot make clay on the Sabbath. And so there's a Sabbath breaking here. So this is an interrogation on the basis of Torah. Is what happened to you allowed under our Torah prescriptions of Sabbath? Verse 14. And again they inquired of him, the Pharisees did, how did he come to see or give you sight? And he said to them, he placed clay upon my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And certain of the Pharisees say as well, this man is not from God. Note the emphasis on anthropos. This man is not from God. This is a commonplace. They recognize him to be a man, but not more than a man. And that he does not hold the Sabbath. Others said, yes, but how is a man who is a sinner able to do such signs? And there was a schism. Here's the idea of thesis. A schism as to, are we to give credence to this guy or no? And they said, again, to the blind man, who actually now sees, what do you say concerning this? That he opened your eyes. And he said, he is a prophet. Now, what is of some interest here is that nowhere in the Old Testament is a prophet said to have given sight to the blind. The only place that uses this is of the suffering servant, that he gives the light of the Gentiles and opens up their eyes. It's a metaphorical use probably of opening eyes, but nonetheless, it's the only time in the prophetic literature that we get this kind. So it might be that suffering servant ideas are beginning to shimmer in a text like this. We keep something like that in mind. But the Jews, we are told, did not believe this guy. And so that he was blind and now sees again. And so they summon, ephonason, they summon, again to a certain pre-legal conference, the man's parents. We are told they summoned the parents of him who now sees them, and they interrogated them. Is this your son, whom you say that he was born blind? How does he see now? Note here, there's a distinction now. There is the son, which they have given birth to, who was born blind, but now there is this son of theirs who sees. And they answered, his parents did, and they said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we have not the slightest idea. We do not. And so here again, we have this common notion that we saw in its own way in John 3:6. The Spirit blows where it wills, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know from where it comes or where it is. So we see that he sees, but how it happened, we have no idea. The same kind of thing happens to Jesus. This man is a Christ figure. And so they continue to, so they say, ask him, for he is of age. He can speak to you concerning them. And the parents, we are told, said these things because they feared the Jews, for already the Jews had laid it down that should anyone confess him to be the Christos, the anointed, they should be put out of the synagogue. This is one of 3 cases in the Gospel of John where this word is used, synagogos, which is, as far as I'm aware, only occurs in John's Gospel. So it's not a technical term, as is sometimes claimed, but it is a term for the exclusion from the synagogue. And of course, later on in John 6, as we've already seen, they will throw him out of the synagogue. And for this reason, then, the parents said, he is of age, talk to him. And so they summoned the man a second time, namely he who is blind, and they say to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Therefore that man says, if he is a sinner, I do not know, but I do know one thing, that I was blind and now I see. And they say to him, what did he do to you or for you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered, I have already told you this, and yet you do not listen. Do you want to hear this again? What do you wish to hear again? Let's see how does this go. Oh, do you also wish, kind of snarky, do you also wish to become his disciple? And they reviled him and said, you, emphatic, you are his disciple, but we, in fact, are the disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but this guy, this Teuton is emphatic. This guy, we have no idea, Pothinus. Again, this adverb from where he is. And the man answered and said to them, and this is quite amazing, that you do not know from where he is, and yet he opened my eyes. For we know that God does not hear a sinner unless he should be pious, a God-fearer, and should do his word, which he hears. From ages on, from the beginning, if you will, no one has ever heard that anyone has opened the eyes of someone who has been born blind. Except if this man is not from God, he would not be able to do anything. And they answered and said to him, and now we have an interesting change. So I'm going to ask, keep in mind what the man just said. From early on, from ages on, no one has ever heard of a man being born blind. That is in the end of verse 32. Now I'm going to ask Greg to read the first half then of verse 34.
If this man were not from God.
Oh, well, go on.
34. Oh, 34.
34.
They answered him, you were born in utter sin.
Yes. Now it can be that here you again have the word genao and genethes. And it can be translated born correctly. In which case it is referring back to John 9:1 that he was born blind. And in fact, they then would be giving a positive answer to the question that the disciples asked of Jesus. Who sinned that this man was born blind? His parents or somebody else? And if we are, so this might mean, you were indeed born in sins back then when you came to me. That could be the meaning. But I have a hunch that we have again a change of meaning of this word. Because they have already accused him of being a disciple of Jesus. You are a disciple of this man. So my hunch is that they are referring to his washing in Siloam, which is kind of a baptismal reference. And so we should translate this way. And they responded and said to him, you have been begotten in sins. In other words, that which brought you into the discipleship of Jesus is sinful. And therefore, you are going to teach us. You are no longer even a member of our synagogal community. And so we're going to toss you out. And yet, he has in fact been teaching them all along. He keeps repeating, he has opened my eyes. Which again, keep in mind, to open the eyes, to give sight, to bring light to the eyes who are blinded and hence in darkness, is in fact to become baptized, or if you want, an image of Torah. The law is a light. So he becomes in fact, a disciple of Torah law because Jesus is. And so he is an image of Jesus. And so he receives the same kind of treatment as Jesus receives and will continue to receive. And now Jesus again appears on the scene. He finds the man. We discussed these following passages a little bit earlier. So it's an interesting kind of baptismal kind of text in which the man assumes Christian contours in the way he speaks of himself. I am. The fact that no one knows of who he is, his own parents do not really know his own new identity. We know he was born blind, but we have no clue how he now sees. Keep in mind, seeing is not merely here a physical fact. Are you happy that he sees? oh, we're so happy that our son now sees. No, none of that. We do not know how he came to see. He's not even our son anymore. We take no responsibility for this guy. So there's a new identity switch. And of course, then the issue arises, from whence does all this happen? And it leads to his excommunication, which again receives thematic Exodus elucidation in the Good Shepherd discourse, where we are told that Jesus leads out his sheep and but goes in front of them, leading them into the new Exodus, and that is to say, into a new reality of the eschatological. Yeah, any questions or listen?
I had heard and read about that Jesus used saliva, went back to the Jewish tradition that the firstborn of the father, his saliva had healing properties. Is there any indication that Jesus would have used that to prove him being the firstborn of God?
Thank you for that comment. There's no reason to exclude that from that, which, by the way, can be documented also in secular sources. So, for example, in a couple of his reports about this or that incident, what have you, somebody like Pliny, for example, in his histories, reports on the use of saliva during the time of trade. And so in medicinal context. So it was a more or less common view, apparently, that saliva did have medicinal properties. What we are not told is that he healed this man's eyes by way of the saliva. We are told that he spit into the ground and made clay, put it upon the eye of the man, and said, "Go and wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." And when he went away and washed away, he came seeing. So it seems to me from the flow of the text that the actual means of seeing was the washing in the pool of Siloam, not the saliva, which is never a discrete element in this story in any case, but the clay. But it doesn't even seem to be that the placing of the clay upon the eyes was itself the healing thing, but the washing. At least that seems to me to be the dynamics of this text. But it isn't. So I don't discount that kind of background as kind of shimmering back there somewhere, but it isn't, in fact, quite probative when one actually takes a look at what he said.
I had also heard or read that the man being born blind was almost him being born blind was almost like he was incomplete, and that the forming of the mud was a completion of his creation.
This is the view that one finds, for example, in Irenaeus, that what Jesus actually did was to form real eyes for the man. Right? So apparently he was born without eyeballs, you know? And so what Jesus did was actually to form eyeballs for him. That we find explicitly in Irenaeus. So what you have heard is just an echo of this very early patristic way of dealing with this text. And hence, typical to Irenaeus, salvation is always the completion of creation. So it fits in his overall schema. And from that point of view, it makes a certain sense. I'm just not quite sure that that's what John is really, this text is really saying. But that's, you're echoing a very ancient way of thinking.
Well, yeah. You mentioned about the blind man being sort of a Christic figure, and then his parents, the fact his parents saying, you know, we don't know, we see, is that kind of like an echo of Joseph and Mary, the child, and then going to the temple, and don't you know that it's supposed to be about, they don't really understand what his mission is?
Well, certainly, I think when you look at the Lutheran context, there it is something along those lines. Here, I think we need to understand the parents' behavior in terms of what we actually find about Jesus elsewhere in this particular text. And that is that, in fact, unless you see him for who he is, you do not know him. And we see this again already in John 1, where John the Baptist says to those Levites and Pharisees who came to him from Jerusalem, there stands amongst you a man whom you do not know. And so that he is not known, he is not recognized, is a common theme within the first 12 chapters. Right? So I think in that sense, this is kind of a Christic echo. Any other questions or comments? Okay, we have here some fewer minutes. So maybe I'm going to dedicate all tomorrow, unless you just have a burning question. We're going to go to the farewell discourse, the Paraclete sayings, and so forth. I want to say something about Thomas. I just very briefly mentioned him yesterday. I want to debunk the idea that he's a doubter, for example. But right now, maybe just a few comments on the raising of Lazarus, which is, in terms of its place in the overall structure, very interesting place. Because the raising of Lazarus from the dead is a lead-in text. And we know this by way of its literary connection. It's a lead-in text for the story of the Passion, which in John's Gospel begins in John 12 with the anointing of the feet by Mary of Bethany. Then, of course, straightway he comes into Jerusalem riding a donkey, which, by the way, is not a scene of humility. That he rides a donkey is to be understood in terms of a story in 1 Kings, in which we are told that David had promised that the son of Bathsheba, Solomon, would be his successor. And what happens is that some of the friends of Solomon, I forgot the name of this guy actually, that he wishes in fact to assume for himself the crown. So what does he do? He climbs upon the kingly mule, as it is said. And so Bathsheba comes to David and says, what is happening here? So-and-so is on the mule, which is the sign of making a claim to kingship. I thought you had promised the crown to my son Solomon. Well, I did. Well, see what's happening here. So David calls in some soldiers and his friends and says, hey, get this guy off this mule and get Solomon on it. And so riding a donkey was a sign of kingly aspiration and acclaim. It has nothing to do with humility. And then we have the story of Absalom, for example, who is riding the mule. What happens to him? We are told that as he rides the mule, his hair gets caught in the branches, right? And what happens? And the mule walks out from under him. It's, of course, an incredibly visual image of a guy being besaddled. But what it also means is that his whole claim to kingship is going south, maybe to Mississippi. Right. So when he comes into Jerusalem on a mule, again, that's his claim to kingship. Also, when you have time, compare the synoptic account of the entry to John. John is much more focused. It's much more slim and slight and short. There's no sense of sending disciples into Jerusalem to find a donkey, none of that. But right now, the raising of Lazarus from the dead is what I've just now called a lead-in story to the beginning of the Passion. And so we might think of it in terms of literary criticism here. What is the function of this story in this place in the gospel structure? And if we ask this question, then perhaps the answer is it tells us if you will, the effects at the end of the story. The end of the story will be in fact the story of resurrection. In any case, it is true that the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and I don't want to deny the miracle or physical character of that, it's not my point, but it is actually told in the conversion story. And so let's just take a quick look at certain aspects of this story, and then we'll concentrate some of our last minutes today when Jesus calls him out of the tomb. Now, what is of interest is the focus upon Mary. In various ways, Mary, not Martha, becomes the focus. That is to say, kind of the true disciple of Jesus. And indeed, we see at the very beginning, and there was a sick man, Lazarus from Bethany, from the town of Mary and Martha, his sister or her sister. Now, Mary was the one who wiped the Lord with myrrh, or anointed the Lord with myrrh and wiped his feet with her hair. Now, there's literally no reason to introduce Mary that way at this time. So what does that do? It means that this story cannot be fully elaborated and interpreted without also looking at the same time with the anointing of his feet, which is for burial. And so already the mention of Mary as the one who anoints his feet, and we look over there, oh, he anoints his feet for burial. So already the mention of Mary here introduces the death of Jesus as part and parcel of the thematic of this raising from the dead. Notice also that when he wishes to go into Judea, the disciples say, in fact, what there? They want to kill you. Why do you want to go? That you all go, Philip. Why do you want to all go there? That's the place where they're going to kill you. So in various ways, the death of Jesus as subtext, if I might use that term again, is throughout this narrative. It's not just a story of a miracle of Jesus raising someone from the dead. It's that in order to raise Lazarus from the dead, Jesus must go there where he is to die. And so the death of Lazarus becomes a function of the willing sacrifice of Jesus. Now, what is also of some interest here is Thomas said, well, let us go and let us die with him. But then we were told that Lazarus was already 4 days dead. This was the technical, you know, the story apparently true in Victorian England, that when somebody died of was not completely known of what causes, they actually would put him in a coffin, but with a pulley on a bell that should in fact be revived in there. He could ring the bell and say, hey, unlock the door, and the man wants to come out. Well, the Jews had something like this. It was a common view that the soul of man hovered the body for 3 days and then would leave, and now the man was dead. So the 4 days is not just a kind of a chronological, hey, he's been dead for 4 days. It's basically to say, the guy's really dead. It's not a resuscitation scheme. But the guy is really dead.
Not just mostly dead.
That's correct. Right. He's not going to be pulling on any bell. And we are told that Bethany was not far from Jerusalem, about 15 or 20 states, and many from the Jews. Keep in mind that in this gospel, the Jews tend to be Sanhedrin types. So many, I would say, from the Sanhedrin came to mourn with Mary and Martha. Now Mary, or rather Martha, heard that Jesus was coming, or having heard that he was coming, met him, while Mary was in the house sitting. And Martha comes to Jesus and says to him, Lord, or Master, were you here, my brother would not have died. And so Jesus, but now I know that should you request God, God shall give to you. Now, this is a very interesting claim, because at this point, Martha is not saying, nor does she seem to believe, that Jesus can raise the dead. God can raise the dead through him, but he has to pray God for God to give him. So Jesus then says to her, your brother shall rise again, and Martha says to him, I know that he shall rise at the resurrection on the last day. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, should he die, shall live. Presumably referring to physical death and then be raised for eternal salvation. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. That seems to refer to the present death, life of faith, or whatever you want to call it. Shall never die forever. And now note how this narrative goes. Jesus continues to say to Martha, do you believe this? I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? To which Martha responds, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who comes into the world. Does she answer his question? No. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? Histories tuto. If she was going to answer the question positively, she would say, yes, I believe that you are the resurrection and the life. But she doesn't say that. And indeed, later, when they come to the tomb, and Jesus says, roll the stone away, or lift up the stone, whatever the form of the tomb would be, what does Martha say? Oh my God, he's been dead for 4 days. There's going to come a great stink out of there. Martha never really comes around in this text, despite the fact that she makes this confession. The great confession of resurrection and the life even precedes that he is, in this case, the Christ, Son of God, which are high titles. In fact, in John 20, 30, and 31, these are the titles of the purpose statement. These things have been written that you may believe that Christ is the Christ, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. But here, they are not quite the point. He's the resurrection and the life. Then we are told, and note the difference. Sometime when you have a chance, pay attention to the difference of how Martha is depicted, how Mary is depicted. Keep in mind, you're going to have to be attuned to Johannine diction. But if you are attuned, you will see that there are significant differences. And having said this, Martha went away and called Mary her sister, and said silently, or in secret, the teacher is present, and what? Summons, calls you. And this is never said of Martha. Jesus is never said to phoneo Martha. But we read in John 10 that Jesus phoneos his own sheep and calls them by name. So this is already a difference between Martha and Mary, that she is called by Jesus himself. And she, when she heard this, rose up. And when you see agerthe, you shall always keep in mind that it does always kind of connote the resurrection of the dead. In any case, she rises up quickly and comes to him. And we know this is not what is said of Martha. She meets him, we are told, on ta'o. But Mary is said to come to Jesus. This is the language of discipleship. Whoever comes to me shall never thirst. Then for Jesus had not yet come into the village, but he was still in, note the language, in that place, hatu, where Martha had met him. And therefore the Jews who were with her in the house, seeing that she rose up quickly and went out, thought that she was going to mourn. And so they followed her, thinking that she was going, note Philip Pago here, to the tomb in order that she might cry. But therefore Miriam, when she came hatu ein, where he was, again we have this spatial that I've mentioned to you throughout, where I am. So he came where Jesus was, seeing him, note the language of seeing, which is never said of Martha, she fell at his feet, which is never said of Martha. So the whole interaction between Jesus and Martha and the whole interaction between Jesus and Mary are by no means parallel. And that's because, at least within the narrative, Mary is going to be, she's going to be the one who anoints Jesus' feet. Then we are told that Jesus was deeply moved. Greg, if you just translate quickly the last half or so of 33, let's see how that verb is translated by the ESV.
He was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled.
Greatly troubled. Okay, deeply moved and greatly troubled. Well, that's fine. The verb here, which is emblemomai, does have to do with certain agitation. It was used, for example, of horses who were fighting the bridle. And so trying to get rid of the bridle and the stirrups. Well, they didn't ride the stirrups, but the horses were agitated. And especially also of horses about to go into battle. There is also very often an undertone of anger in the use of the verb. And we should probably keep that here. But the question really is why, and this is the strongest note of Jesus' emotions that we have in the entirety of the gospel narratives, even in the synoptics. It's a very strong word. And later on, it is combined with what is it here? Terrasso, he called himself, strictly speaking. That's a very strong term in any case. So Jesus was deeply agitated and perhaps with a note of anger. But the question is, why at this point does he suffer these emotions? And I think the answer to this is that when Jesus says, verse 34, where have you laid him? And they say to him, Master, come and see. An interesting phraseology too, given what is said in John 1. But where have you laid him? I think Jesus suffers this agitation because he's now going to go to the tomb, the place of death. And so I like the interpretation of a 4th century commentator by the name of Apollinarius. Yes, in fact, the heretic, Apollinarius of Laodicea, but he also had comments on John's Gospel that can be very insightful. And he likens this to a soldier, a cavalryman who is about to go on a charge, who gets himself, and you see this if you saw Braveheart. I mean, everybody yells like mad to get themselves up for the battle, right? And so Jesus actually is steeling himself for a confrontation. In any case, we are told that again in 38, he was again deeply moved, perhaps with anger, in himself, and he comes to the tomb. And there was a stone and a seal placed upon it, and Jesus says, take the stone away. It suggests, perhaps, since it's the language of take and not roll, that here the tomb is understood to be kind of not into the side of the hill, but more underneath the ground. There are two different forms. But be that as it may, now Mary says, the sister of the one who was dead, interesting way they phrase her. And Jesus says to her, or she said, yes, to, did I not tell you, Jesus says, that should you believe, you shall see the glory of God. And of course, here the glory of God is the raising of Lazarus. And therefore, they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes above and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. Indeed, I know that you always hear me, but it is for the sake of these who stand around that I have said what I have said, in order that they might believe that you have sent me. And having said these things with a loud voice, he cried out, Lazarus, come out. Now we begin to see that, yes, this is a miracle story, if you want, but it's the language of conversion. And it's the language also of an exodus. The tomb is symbolic of Israel. Keep in mind that Paul speaks in a similar manner in 2 Corinthians 3 when he wishes to compare his apostolicity with the diaconia of Moses. And so he speaks of the diaconia of Moses as the diaconia to thought not to, as the service or ministry of death. But my apostolicity is the diakoniates zoes, the ministry of life. So the tomb as the place of death is also symbolic of Israel, or if you will, unbelieving Israel. So when Jesus summons him to come out, he is bringing him out of Israel, so understood, to his own discipleship, as we see as the text continues. And the man who was dead, or had been dead, comes out bound in foot and his hands, and around his face is a sudarion, a cloth. And we will meet that same word in the tomb of Jesus. And so, if you're bound, of course, he's bound by foot and hands. That's what they did. They wrapped them up. It's true at the physical and literal level. But it's also being bound in foot and around your opsis, your sight, means he's bound, he can't walk. The holocaust notion that was introduced to us earlier today by Sarah, he cannot see because he's bound across the eyes. And so what does Jesus say? Let him loose. Loose him. Take that all away. And let him, and what's the verb now, Philip? Let him upago. Right? And again, this is the language of discipleship, often associated with discipleship unto the cross. It is said of Jesus that he is going, upago, to Jerusalem or to Judea or to the Father, or wherever. Upago always has cruciform connotations in this gospel. And sure enough, what happens then to Lazarus? We are told that many of the Jews, therefore, when they came to Miriam and saw what Jesus had done, believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and said to them what Jesus had done. And so what happens then? The high priests now make their appearance, and the Pharisees, and they gather together. This is the language an official Sanhedrin meeting. They gather together. What is this? What are we going to do that this man does such great signs? If we allow him to continue this way, everybody's going to believe in him. And the Romans are going to come and take from us this place and the people. And so Caiaphas, the priest of that year, high priest of that year, says, by way of a prophecy, we are told that it's better that one die for the nation than all people. In other words, prophesies that the people will be saved if this man dies. And so then we are told that Jesus then was aware of these plans that were made. Note the language of verse 53. From that very day, they ebuloisanta, that's the technical language, they made a determination that they would kill him. And here we see what is sometimes referred to as a proscriptio or praescriptio legal proceeding in which someone is condemned before their arrest. And so when in fact they are arrested and appear in court, the only thing left to do is to prove the rightness of the arrest, to bring forth witnesses. And so we are told, for example, 55 to 57 is filled with legal terminology. For example, the entelos in verse 58 is the language of warrants of arrest, or the language of, especially with didona, you see deducation in it. They gave out entelos, they put out warrants for his arrest, that should anyone name you say, if anyone should give information about them, they might be apprehended. This is the background of Judas. The warrants of arrest were already there, so they are inviting people to squeal on people, which Judas then in fact does. Likewise, the language zeteo, although it can mean quite neutrally to seek, in this legal context, it means the police were out searching for you. So these verses are deeply legal in their meanings. And it means that Jesus was fundamentally condemned before he was ever arrested. So when finally brought to trial, he had to prove his innocence. Always hard to do. So this, and then we are told, I should end perhaps today, at the end of the anointing of his feet, so 12:9 and following, we are told then in verse, 10, that the high priest and the Pharisees also determine, note the same language, ebiloisanta, make an official determination that kaikon lotzeron, apokitenos, that Lazarus as well should be killed. Why? Because many through him, what's the verb now, Philip? Eupago. Exactly, the same verb, right? Through him, many of the Jews were going, that means leaving Judaism and following and believing in Jesus, becoming his disciples. So as I said yesterday, we learn from John's gospel that Jesus had success in Jerusalem, and that success was not merely among the hoi polloi, but even among the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin. That's what got Jesus and Lazarus in trouble. Of course, they didn't like insurrections. They didn't want people stirring up the crowds. That's all true enough. But when the Sanhedrin itself was turning over, that was a problem. And we are told that that's really the impetus. John's gospel is for Jesus done in, as well as the plan for Lazarus, although we're never told that he was in fact done in. Perhaps so.
I'm a little concerned at the division between Martha and Mary, and especially when you get in chapter 12, it's they're at the supper and Martha's serving, and Mary's the one, go back to her, I guess in Luke's gospel, she's serving the place. But Is this a level of devotion here? We're not saying there's a rejection here that John is showing in Martha.
Well, I is there rejection? No, she calls him, she calls him Rabbi Didascalos. But she does not, in fact, speak of him in the terms that Jesus speaks of himself. And again, I have pointed out this interesting play of kind of Johannine language that is occurring around the depiction of Mary that does not occur at all around Martha. And again, that it's Martha who at the tomb, even there, is not, says, hey, he's going to stay. So Martha doesn't come off well here. I'm not sure I want to say she's rejecting Jesus. There's nothing like that, but she's not full bore. And it's not kind of, this isn't assuaged by the fact that she serves at table. That we favor Martha as the one who serves at the table and Mary is kind of the contemplative. That served early church notions of two kinds of life.
Mm-hmm.
The vita pratica and the vita contemplativa. And so Martha was the one who was the image of the active life. And Mary was the image of the contemplative life who just wants to sit at the feet of Jesus and learn. And meanwhile, making Martha alone to bake the chicken and make the potato salad and all the rest and even serve the table. Well, get off your hind end, Mary, and help out. So Martha has tended to be, in history, the winner. But she's not in these texts.
Not in the monastic tradition, right?
Pardon?
Not in the monastic tradition.
No, not in the monastic tradition, where Martha comes off quite well, because she's the image of the contemplative.
Yeah,
Excuse me, Mary.
It's Mary choosing the better portion.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And that's which reinforces what I'm saying here, is articulated in this particular text. So Mary, now, I wouldn't want to make too much of this. I simply note when I read the text that there are these differences. And I do find it striking that when Jesus asks Martha, do you believe this? And she can't answer the question, at least in the terms in which it is asked. That at least is an interesting fact. And what do you do with that fact? Somebody like John Chrysostom says, well, she was, John Chrysostom says that he's not alone. Well, she was so distraught over the death of her brother that she just was kind of, as women can be, a little bit emotionally over the top. Well, I'm not quite sure that I'm not going to go there. I'm at least enough of a feminist not to go there. Now, if Sarah were here, I would have other things to say.
It seems to me it's just that Mary understands, like Jesus' own disciples take a long time to figure it out. It makes sense that Mary understands better if she was the one who was actually paying perhaps attention to him when he speaks. So. And Martha, I think her response could be boiled down to, I don't know what you mean by claiming to be the resurrection and the life, but you recognize it to be the Messiah. So sure, that sounds good.
Well, there's no doubt that what Martha actually says are his tiger.
Yes.
But at the same time, they can be understood. Keep in mind, when she wants to talk about the resurrection, she gives the common eschatological notion.
Right.
That Lazarus will raise on the last day. The idea that he who believes in me even now shall never die. That's not what she's up to yet. So, and keep in mind, I mean, from the beginning, as I pointed out, Mary is the one who's introduced She is the one already wiping of the feet of Jesus or anointing them and wiping the hair unto his burial. So Mary is, I think, if you just read the text, just alone as a literary presentation, Mary is highlighted in a way Martha is not. I will simply make that observation and not wish to make too much more of it. Certainly not that Martha is seen as some sort of unbeliever or something.
Even with the disciples, Jesus.
Well, the disciples also are non-knowers, incomprehensible.
Keep John very Peter.
That's absolutely right too.
So there's two kinds of incomprehension in John. It's not just comprehension of the ones who reject, but the Jews. They don't comprehend because they don't want to. They reject them in prima facie. But the others, the disciples, they don't understand it yet. They accept it in prima facie.
Yes, and usually when the disciples are said not to understand these things or so, they says, but they did come to know about them or comprehend them when Jesus had risen from the dead or when Jesus had been glorified or something like that. In other words, the death and resurrection of Jesus was the key for understanding his own identity. Well, I just put this forward to you, Philip, for your
Oh, that's fine. So
thoughts.
the distinction of Mary is that she's reading, learning, marking, and inwardly digesting. Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, it's interesting, they both give the same sort of complaint slash praise to Jesus. You know, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. You know, both sort of the complaint and the confession of his, but put different emphasis on that.
Definitely, because she says it has having gone down to his feet, right? She bows, goes to his feet, and now says this.
Yeah.
So there is a different posture when she says this.
Is it very coincidental that she shares the name of the icon?
I'm sorry?
Is it fairly coincidental that her name is Mary, just like the icon of the church is Mary?
Well, I don't think so, because obviously the icon of the church is the Virgin. Mary was a fairly common name. So Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalena, Mary of Magdala, Sea of Galilee area. And the tradition about Mary and Martha and Lazarus is pretty interesting. Because very early on, already in Tertullian, Mary of Bethany and Mary of Magdalene are confused. And so the tradition of these various Marys is totally complex and screwed up. But I think what we can say is that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, although I've interpreted the rising of Lazarus or the raising of Lazarus from the dead to be as a word story, a movement out of Judaism to the discipleship of Jesus. They do seem to have been, I'll use the term here, associates of Jesus from the very beginning. Because he does call them, all three of them, friends. Not see how he loved him. That's spoken of Lazarus, but earlier on it states that he loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. All three are mentioned. So that's the language of friendship and intimacy, but it's also the language of association. Because the friends of Caesar were his political, advisors and supporters who would not leave him. That's his friend. So when Jesus says, I call you my philoi, say in the farewell discourse, he's basically saying, you are my associates. It's not just that I like to bowl with you.
Fantasy.
So they are his associates and who support him and share his mission and that kind. So when do we meet tomorrow morning?
Tomorrow worship at 9.
Okay.
Oh, no, I didn't see it. All right.
And we'll go to around 12 or so. I want to get on the road if I can to go as far north as I can before I hit the sack. I have to get to Indy to spend a free night in my daughter's house in Indianapolis. So I can get going on that because frankly, I-65 is a pain in the butt. And I don't know what the deal was, but coming down, I don't know what the going north was, but something, there was a traffic jam at, I talked 5 miles. And no one was moving.
Should be safe on Wednesday.
Yeah, I'm hoping that was that Sunday, right? They were all coming from Forest Cave or someplace. Okay.
Make sure you pick that long.
So, okay, 9 o'clock and we'll try to spend time Sunday. I'll start with the parachute things, make sure we get that. And then, again, whatever the discourse you're interested in, let me know.